Master, how did life arise in the silent, lifeless universe?
The first step was not life itself, but the appearance of organic molecules. In the early universe, there were only simple elements, such as hydrogen and helium. But as nuclear fusion occurred inside stars and supernova exploded, heavier elements, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and so on, were synthesized and dispersed throughout the universe. These elements provided the fundamental building blocks for life. When these elements accumulated on planets and existed under suitable conditions such as moderate temperature, liquid solvents, and energy input, complex chemical reactions could occur. Earth's early atmosphere contained methane, ammonia, water vapor, and other substances. Under the influence of energy sources such as lightning and ultraviolet radiation, organic molecules like amino acids could form naturally. The next crucial step was self-organization. Under certain conditions, molecules do not remain randomly dispersed forever. Instead, they spontaneously form more ordered structure. For example, some lipid molecules automatically arrange themselves into biliary structure, creating something similar to a membrane. Some molecules gather into tiny vesicles, separating the internal environment from the external one. This is already the prototype of a cell. In other words, as long as the environment permits it, matter can spontaneously move from disorder toward local order under the influence of energy. What comes next is the story we are familiar with. A certain kind of molecule began to replicate itself. Replication produced errors. Different variants performed differently in their environments. More stable and efficient structures were preserved. This was the starting point of natural selection. In other words, from that moment onward, the system was no longer merely existing, began to evolve.
I more or less understand that. My question is this. The universe is cold, chaotic, and purposeless, yet it can evolve beings that maintain themselves and even think. Where exactly is the boundary between the dead and the living?
That is actually a fairly common illusion. It comes from an innate philosophical tendency, the assumption that the universe ought to be uniform. However, more and more research suggests that the universe is not uniform. It is more likely hierarchical, or step-like in nature.
What do you mean?
Take the numbers 0 and 1 as an example. Clearly, 0 is not equal to 1. But if the world were truly uniform, there would be no obvious boundary between them. And in theory, 0 could infinitely approach 1, mathematically. This is obviously incorrect. If the world were uniform, it would also imply that the physical world could be divided infinitely, which does not match our observation. Experiments tell us that fundamental particles have lower limits. In other words, when you break particles apart, the process cannot continue forever. To some extent, this suggests that the emergence of matter itself is a process that goes from 0 to 1.
Doesn't that mean matter appeared out of nothing? That doesn't sound like physics. It sounds more like mysticism.
That brings us to an important concept, emergence. Roughly speaking, it means that when a system becomes sufficiently complex, entirely new properties appear. Properties that do not exist in any individual component. A single water molecule is not wet, but a large collection of water molecules exhibits wetness. A single molecule has no temperature, but a group of molecules can generate temperature. A single air molecule cannot produce sound, but the vibration of many molecules can form sound waves. The curve of change is generally continuous, but at certain stages the system displays properties that are fundamentally different from what came before. It is a bit like climbing stairs. The distance between the first and second steps is continuous. Yet the first step and the second step are not the same step. That is why the physical world can be described as step-like, from the macroscopic world down to the Planck scale. This phenomenon is everywhere. Simply put, quantitative change leads to qualitative change. The origin of life follows the same pattern. Life did not suddenly jump from nothing to something. Instead, it gradually evolved within the material world through a series of continuous chemical and physical processes. At first, there was no clear dividing line, but when chemical reactions became sufficiently complex, that line was crossed. The dead became alive, and life emerged. Of course, the process and conditions have been simplified here for the sake of understanding. The formation of life was indeed the result of many low-probability events accumulating over time. It was not merely a pileup of probabilities. It was a process governed by mechanisms. What makes life special is not its materials, but its structure and dynamic processing. Life is not a pile of matter. It is a continuously operating state.
That makes sense, but it still doesn't seem to explain certain things. For example, why does consciousness arise?
One of the most mainstream views today is that consciousness is also an emergent phenomenon, processing system reaching a certain level of complexity. The brain consists of tens of billions of neurons. Each neuron is merely a simple signal processing unit. Yet when they form complex networks, they continuously engage in feedback and integration. A new phenomenon may emerge, the experience of information. Several theories attempt to explain it. For example, integrated information theory proposes that consciousness is related to the degree of information integration within a system. Global workspace theory, on the other hand, suggests that consciousness arises when information is broadcast throughout the brain. From these perspectives, consciousness can indeed be viewed as a form of emergence.
But does that really explain why I have subjective experiences? Why am I not simply a purely objective computational process, a material system acting mechanically?
That is precisely the famous heart problem. Science can explain how the brain processes information and how neural activity corresponds to behavior, but it cannot explain why these processes feel like something from the inside. Why are they not merely unconscious computation? In other words, we can explain the objective, but we cannot explain the subjective. At present, there are several major speculations about this issue. The first speculation: consciousness is entirely an emergent property of the brain. Millions upon millions of neurons work together to produce extraordinarily complex patterns of thought. The subjective experience within these patterns is essentially an illusion. It is simply the result of millions of years of evolutionary optimization for action and survival. Your emotions, memories, and cognition are the combined outcome of genes, hormones, external stimuli, conditioned responses, and many other factors. There is nothing mysterious or special involved. The principles are simply so complex that we do not yet fully understand them. This is a relatively mainstream view. However, to be honest, because this explanation is so objective and does not align well with human intuition, many people find it unconvincing.
Exactly. So are there any other explanations?
The second speculation: consciousness is a case of strong emergence. Unlike the previous explanation, this theory argues that consciousness is still a physical phenomenon, but a very special one. Subjective experience itself is evidence of this special physical property. Consciousness is not the result of neuronal computation. Rather, it is a completely new level of existence that comes into being when the brain reaches a sufficient level of complexity. This property is not merely difficult to explain, it is, in principle, impossible to derive from lower-level rules. The difference between strong emergence and weak emergence is this: the latter views consciousness as a reducible complex outcome. In principle, all conscious activity can be explained through underlying physical laws. The former argues that consciousness cannot be fully measured. Even if you knew the exact state of every neuron, you still could not precisely deduce what experiences would arise.
I see. Is there an even more radical explanation?
Yes, panpsychism. Its core idea is this: consciousness is one of the fundamental properties of the universe. All matter possesses some extremely faint form of intrinsic experience. The brain merely amplifies and organizes these experiences. Or, put differently, consciousness may not depend on matter at all. Instead, it may be something even more fundamental. Under this view, the brain is a system that carries or generates consciousness, rather than consciousness itself. Some versions of the idea even suggest that the universe, as a whole, may be a higher-level conscious system. The emergence of life then becomes something like the reorganization of scattered fragments of faint consciousness throughout the universe. This could even provide an explanation for the universe's purpose. However, while this view is certainly romantic, it lacks solid scientific evidence. The mainstream position today remains either strong emergence or weak emergence. After all, nearly all known matter behaves according to material principles. Why should consciousness be treated as a special exception simply because we ourselves are conscious? That attitude may not be very different from the mindset of people centuries ago who believed that Earth was the center of the universe. Returning to the original question, how did life arise in a silent, lifeless universe? Perhaps the answer can be expressed like this. In this seemingly indifferent universe, matter continuously reorganizes itself under the influence of energy, moving from simple structures to complex structure, from disorder toward local order. Eventually, in certain places, it crosses a critical threshold and forms systems capable of reproducing themselves. And further still, it forms systems capable of perceiving themselves consciously. Life is not a miracle, and consciousness may not be either. They are perhaps better understood as inevitable consequences of complexity unfolding through time. Life and consciousness did not suddenly appear, nor did they emerge through a sharp transition from dead to alive. Rather, through continuous change. Under certain local conditions, structures naturally develop that could maintain themselves, reproduce themselves, and eventually even understand themselves. And we are one manifestation of such a structure.